How you doing, everybody? It's Monday evening here in Minnesota. Just closed the cafe up a little early today. Got some tax prep stuff got to do. Need to get this episode wrapped up. And today we're going to talk about capital. And it's a really outstanding label. It's like an outstanding, body of work. It's definitely on the lighter, poppier side of things. Uh, there's a great little 6500 sequence which runs at the very end of this video that I'll show you with only 12 titles, but it's some pretty serious stuff. Some pretty great players that I've spoken about many times. Some of that West Coast cool bop I talk about on Bethlehem. This is some of their capital stuff, and it's fairly forward, fairly up-tempo, fairly bright. I mean, as aggressive as these white cats can be. It's funny how I still get pushback from people on the difference in emoting between a black man and a white man in America. Yet it's never the black man who's having an issue with what I'm saying. It's always some white guy saying, "Oh my God, black players, white players play the same." Excuse me. And no one's saying that white players don't play. I've never said that. I've always said that they're just telling you a different story because their experience and their environment are very different. And that's what informs art. Experience, environment, and personality. That's what art speaks from. And an artist wants you to understand where they're coming from, and they're speaking on their understanding, and they want you to feel something that is relatable to their environment, experience, and personality, what I often call the three brush strokes of not just jazz, really, of music, art in general. Environment, experience, and then that personality will all help explain what an artist is about and where they're coming from and what they're trying to say. And anyone who doesn't think that a black man's emoting is going to be different than a white guy's, I mean, listen to a white rapper and a black rapper. They're going to be talking about very different things for the most part. And they're going to have some similarities and share some common backgrounds and some common interests at times. Both sides of that camp are going to still want good education, clean water, healthcare. Those things don't have racial lines. I mean, the social constructs that the blacks and whites are looking for, we share a very similar agenda, but the experiences are very different. The background that we live in, the intensity, the risk are very different. And very few white cats in America are willing to put themselves in the place of understanding what the terror was like of living as a black man in the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, and still today as a young black youth. You have a target on your back. And white males, they can get a lot of second chances. Black males certainly get less and have always gotten less, and it just leads to a different kind of drain on your energy. And again, the whole shaman witch doctor thing I've talked about with the mask, you carve that mask to protect yourself and the village from evil spirits. These guys played to protect themselves. It was a place of calm, a place of soothing, a place of healing. And so they played and spoke from their soul and not from their mind or their ego. And that's just a very different thing that informs art. Am I trying to make art because I'm thinking about how great I want people to think I am? Or am I trying to make art because my soul and my spirit's trying to quench a fire that's burning hot and I'm exhausted? They come from very different sources. And it's not to say a white guy can't speak from his soul. Absolutely they can. And it's not to say that black guys don't speak from ego. Those lines do blur. But when you're talking about Eddie Lockjaw Davis, a guy that just plays the blues and the black church in his horn, every time he puts that to his mouth, he's speaking something. Sweets Edison, Lee Morgan. There's a potency to what Morgan is saying. And if you think there's not a militancy in what Morgan has to say, you've never listened to Chuck D. And you never listened to Curtis Mayfield, that's for sure. And if you haven't listened to Curtis Mayfield and Chuck D speak about the black experience in the 70s and the 80s, then you certainly have no concept of what Lee Morgan was talking about the black experience in the 50s. Pre-civil rights. It's a hot thing. And boy, our misconceptions are so strong in this country. We're so misinformed. And the right really wants to diminish the price that was paid and the sacrifice that was made by so many blacks in this country to find freedom for their fellow kindred man. And I mean, some of the comments, it's rare, to be honest. Most people who watch my channel know what they're in for. But still once in a while, someone just takes umbrage with my beliefs and how I hear this stuff. And by no means am I the end all be all of it. Everyone's open to their own interpretation of art, absolutely. But all the same, it's just where I'm coming from at this time. So we're going to move on. We're going to first show you some RCA pieces and Decca pieces that I've filled in. We'll talk about those quickly as we move through this photo slide. But then we'll get into the capital and the body of work. And I've been waiting for a few things to come in the mail, which is partly why this episode took so long. And then I was kind of busy last weekend, which was good because during last week we had a snowstorm for 3 days. We were next to as dead as we've been. And I'd love to get this episode done then, but I was waiting for the mail to show up, and the weather wasn't helping the mail show up. And then come weekend, and the weekend just slipped by me so fast. So we're going to do it today. We're going to run through this capital stuff. I'm looking forward to it. There's some great titles in there. I've added most of the stuff that's coming. And I just counted today. I think I have like 10, 11, 12, 15 more capitals in the mail now. But I have most of the ones I really wanted to have to show you, just to really give us the scale and perspective of what these labels were doing. And again, maybe 10% of what Decca, Columbia, Capitol, and RCA were doing was jazz. And there's probably another 10% on top of that that's pop jazz, that borrows from the jazz language, but isn't jazz in that sense. I mean, most of us wouldn't put a lot of those records on. And even some of the 10% that I'm going to show you, some of this stuff, I think, for a lot of people would be a little commercial, especially for the Lee Morgan crowd, you know. But I mean, if you're Scott Baldwin, you'll understand the value of some of these records. You understand the breadth of the foundation, and this stuff is foundational, you know. And there's some pretty important players in here. And once again, we're going to see that a lot of the greats from the earlier era that are black will be issued by these labels, Capitol included, and that much black music from that present moment is very absent. Very absent. And we're going to be starting in the early 50s with Capitol, with the 10-inch stuff, going through the late 50s into the 60s. And there's going to be very little. I mean, here's a great example. Even that Birth of the Cool LP that's going to show up in 500-600, wherever that is, that music was made 6-7 years before that. This is by no means the current release of Birth of the Cool. That's not when that came from. The LP era. It comes from the late 78 RPM era. And it was never really packaged as a unit up until that point. So it's just interesting to see what these big labels were doing, what middle America was being fed, what people were voting for in the Playboy jazz polls, the Downbeat jazz polls. These were the artists they knew, and these were all big artists, well-selling artists. I did this interesting graph the other day, and how the Columbia, the RCA, the Deccas, the Capitols, these labels are at the top of this graph from, 1950 through 1970. They're up here selling millions of records around the world. And labels like Atlantic and Mercury, they kind of start off very small, and they manage to climb and distribute and get to that, pretty much the same level as the Columbias eventually. Atlantic by the 70s, is doing Led Zeppelin and massive Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young records, and Atlantic goes mainstream, Mercury gets kind of phased out, but the Mercury label is one of the major labels of the 70s, with all kinds of rock and disco and funk and stuff on the the Mercury imprint. Verve, MGM distributes Verve, so Verve has a massive distribution. So you see some of these labels start very small, like a Clef Margran, become Verve, and then eventually climb into the middle and almost to the mainstream. But then the Blue Notes, the Savoys, the Prestige, these labels exist along the bottom of this graph. It'd be something I'd like to do. I'd end up doing it with pen and paper and marker because that's just the era I come from. I know there's some cat out here listening right now that could probably do this all on a computer in an hour. But, it's the Blue Note. It blips 3,000, 5,000. Up here, they're selling 50,000 copies, 100,000 copies of a jazz record. Sketches of Spain, 100,000 copies. Verve selling probably 30,000 copies of some of those records. And then in the middle here, you have Contemporary Fantasy and Bethlehem Pacific Records, which were largely white labels selling to white kids, college kids. Pretty contemporary stuff, fairly outstanding stuff. I love most of their discographies, I really do. But their distribution instantly was bigger than the Blue Note Prestige Savoys. So they start probably more in the $20,000, $30,000, and not dollars, units, I'm guessing. And a lot of this is just being revealed to me, A, by the collection, B, by collecting them and searching carts and discogs and stores. I've searched 1,000 record stores in the last 10 years on discogs alone. And I just searched jazz, put a year parameter in, and I'm just searching sometimes 800, 1,000 records in a record store. And over the years of doing this, I know the stuff I've seen repeatedly over and over and over and over again. And I know also the stuff I see somewhat frequently. I see the stuff that's priced somewhat expensively. It's because that stuff's, if it's on a Pacific title, it's kind of hard to get, but it's not super hard to get. Then the Hank Bowlby Blue Note stuff, that stuff's so rare because it didn't sell. Even though there's millions of different pressings of it at this point, the original stuff it's rare as a dodo bird, and it's because it just didn't have that type of distribution. And so doing all these record labels, just seeing these massive labels and filling in some of their catalog, it's just crazy how much more distribution and power and representation these artists got in that time than the greats like Sonny Rollins and Thelonious Monk. Here's two great examples. George Shearing and Marion McPartland. Both fantastic British musicians. Both came over here and started off on the Savoy labels and some of the smaller, I think Shearing has a thing at Discovery and at Savoy, and but they both end up at Capitol, and they both end up making dozens of records for Capitol and being very successful. And so even though they were British and they had the chops, they could play, they were granted the keys of the kingdom and they were given all kinds of financial reward for being great jazz players. And again, it's somewhat at the expense of the black talent that was driving so much of the creativity and the desperation that fuels a lot of that energy and that freneticism that they play with. So those guys, the Blakeys of the world, I think he even made a comment once about some of the Europeans coming over and taking jobs away from black musicians. And it's not even being critical of the European players. It's just, it's hard enough as a black musician to get work. And all these white cats are already filling up most of the good jobs and most of the college tours and the good studios. As a black musician, your lot was much tougher. You were getting paid a fraction of what the white artists at Contemporary and a fraction of what the artists went into the mainstream at Columbia or a Capitol. And the legacy of these guys, I mean, thank goodness for us jazz collectors who remember the Art Blakeys and the Lee Morgans, because they certainly didn't have the accolades in their lifetime. They certainly didn't have the record sales in their lifetime, but they are a lot of the story. They are a lot of the grit of the story, the hero. I mean, and somehow history has let those real driving forces become elevated to the place where they belong. Monk lived in obscurity during his life, but now he's seen fairly highly in esteem, which is fantastic. So without any further ado, let's kind of dive into this Capitol stuff and we'll see where it goes from there. Okay, so we're going to take a look at first some RCA titles here. This is some Glenn Miller and some Swedish musicians on RCA early on, the two different series, 3000. That 1000 is the first RCA LP, Armstrong 1005. 1125 with some good young players, some pretty hip stuff. Some Bud Powell, which comes up in RCA here. Touch of Blues by Lee Wiley, one of those great singers, and Cootie Williams, of course, who played with Ellington for all those years. You got Skin Tight by Marty Gold, some Brer Batch of Satch, some Desmond Blue which is actually a record I've had a long time. I just omitted it in my first series of photos somehow. Joe Morello, who played with Brubeck, fantastic drummer. That's the RCA version of the Vic Blakey record and the great Ethel Ennis. Good stuff. She's a nice singer. Some Vic stuff here, some Marty Gold. Cool cover. After Midnight again on Vic, the Helen Greco. And trombone scene just has a lot of the premier trombone players of that day. Bobby Dukoff, who I just looked up who he played with. It wasn't Charlie Barnett, but it was one of the big white swing bands. Julie Wilson, So there's some Decca stuff here. Cy Oliver, Red Norvo Trio. Again, we're back to 10 inches at this point. Cy worked with a lot of the big bands as an arranger. Some Brunswick stuff, Johnny Guarnieri, Red Nichols, some early Woody Herman. So this gives you a feel where Decca, Corral is at this point. Brunswick again. Now we're Decca 8038. We got Armstrong. We got Ella Fitzgerald, more Ella Fitzgerald. And this is an earlier Fitzgerald that's more being influenced by the beboppers. Armstrong, Benny Goodman story. And this is all Decca stuff I've filled in the last month or so. And a lot of the stuff's out there to be had for $5, $10, $15. Armstrong, again, Jazz Lab, John Gross, Vicky Benet, the French Touch, kind of a pop thing with a little jazz feel. Peggy Lee, Lady and the Tramp from the film. The Great Hazel Scott, which is a beautiful copy of that record I got for a great price. She's a fantastic pianist. More Ella Fitzgerald, more Louis Armstrong. So you can see that Decca has a couple of great black artists, but it's someone they're very established, they're very safe, they're very Herskin Hawkins, another great black artist with two beautiful white women on the cover, more King Louis Armstrong. And Decca switches to the 4000 sequence after they ran out of numbers. This is some Corral stuff, some really Les Brown and his Band of Renown. The Great Cab Calloway, which is kind of late 50s for him. Sidney Bechet story. Probably some European tracks on there, Arctic Sessions. Here we go, Capitol. Songs by K-Star, Nat King Cole. That's Jackie Gleason, Paul the great player. A little compilation. Some Stan Kenton, Art Tatum, Billy Butterfield, Stan Kenton, Jerry Mulligan. So these are going by kind of fast here. Stan Kenton, Goodman again. Paul Smith, the great pianist, worked with Ella Fitzgerald. Four Freshmen and Stan Kenton. Jimmy Joffrey, that's a pretty modern piece. Now we go back to the 12 inches here. Stan Kenton Encores, more Stan Kenton. He was a very predominant figure at Capitol, and a big part of Capitol's early success. Ema Sumac, one of the parts of that Exotica, Woody Herman, again, one of Stan Kenton's main rivals on the West Coast. Nat Cole is going to be a predominant figure here at Capitol. He has a lot of records, and he was their safe black artist. He was like Belafonte at RCA. That LMA Morris record, boy, let me tell you about that. We'll talk more about that in my next episode. Stan Kenton, again, Woody Herman in the 5s and 600s, more Kenton. Some early Ellington stuff, some Nat King Cole Trio, which is a fantastic session. You see how much of a player he really was. June Christie, and there's actually two different versions of that with different mixes. Two different sessions. Rugal, I think, was behind one of them. Jimmy Joffrey, Tangents and Jazz is a really out there record for that time. Herman, Benny Goodman, more K-Star, Blue Mood. It's pretty crazy to see. She's a great singer. Here's some early Sinatra stuff. When he first comes over from Columbia, this was 10-inch material initially. Fantastic stuff, though, without question. More Ema Sumac, which actually was a 10-inch originally. Jackie Davis, a great organ player. Bobby Hackett, a fantastic trumpet player who plays with Jack Teagarden and others. More Duke Ellington, rocking with Milt Buckner, Sinatra at a young age. His early Capitol stuff's just full of energy and life. Kenton and Christie, of course, June Christie came from the Kenton Orchestra. Ellington showcased more Ellington at Capitol. I am not sure if the Ellington stuff here is contemporary from this era or if it's older material. It's probably from the 50s, I would guess. More Cole, just a fantastic singer. Cole's body of work really has a wide range to it. Joel Bushkin, more Stan Kenton. The Human Fire record is pretty fantastic, I gotta say. Obviously influenced by what was happening around the music world. Serge Chaloff's the great Boston player who plays the baritone. And just a wonderful bluesy player. I had a bad drug habit, sadly. There's Birth of the Cool, number 762. That Wildest by Louis Prima is a fantastic record. More Paul Smith again. Fantastic stuff. Sinatra, Woody Herman, Marion McPartland. And she'll show up here quite a bit in these next few 100 records by Capitol. Here's some more Sinatra, some more Nat King Cole. It's just kind of what Capitol was about. And somebody said, that's a fantastic session, by the way, that one. Frank Sinatra, some Coleman Hawkins, more Nat King Cole. It's fairly standard, safe, but outstanding material. It really is. June Christie, Louis Prima, that's another fantastic record. Pennies from Heaven, a couple other fantastic songs are on there. Sinatra, June Christie, some Jack Teagarden, some more. I believe that's Paul Smith, the piano player. I really dig his stuff. He's a wonderful player. Peggy Lee. I mean, Peggy Lee's body of work at Capitol is outstanding. And so, again, Capitol has a lot of the great singers, and it seems to be something they're really comfortable with, but you're not seeing a lot of cutting-edge jazz here by any means. Dakota Staton, here's a later LMA Morse LP. It's different from her first one, that Boogie Woogie one. Boy, that will shake your foundations. Sinatra, here's some Hackett and Teagarden playing together right there. I don't know much about Bobby Hackett, but he has a couple great album covers here. That one there, Gotham Jazz by Bobby Hackett, such a great album cover. More Marion McPartland. Dolores Gray was an actress, and there's a couple of smoky, seductive songs on that record I love. Some Dave Pell, some more great Louis Prima, more June Christie. I thought Prima made more stuff at Capitol, but he leaves for Dot and makes a lot of records at Dot for a long time. Jonah Jones, a great black trumpet player who kind of gets underappreciated today because he was on Capitol, sadly. You know what I mean? That was the compromise. You got known then, sold well then, no one knows about you now. Kenton, more Nat Cole, St. Louis Blues. I mean, it's pretty safe stuff. A lot of great album covers, nice fonts. More early Peggy Lee. Ethel Ennis, who was a great record at Jubilee. Her stuff at Capitol and RCA is good, but I mean, that early Jubilee one's fantastic. Les Brown, again, great cover, Empire State Building. Dakota Staton, another singer that shows up and is just fantastic. More of the fantastic Stan Kenton. Bobby Hackett at the Embers, Jonah Jones Quartet. Fun covers, a lot of the Jonah Jones stuff, and the song was June by June Christie. And you gotta love June Christie's records. Pete Rugolo has a lot to do with those. This is June. Now we're on in the 1000s. So Hank Jones, whose Capitol records are pretty fantastic. Some of the best jazz, I think, on Capitol is Hank Jones, 2 or 3 LPs. Peggy Lee's records, they really go from jazz to pop. And her jazzy stuff, just like a Julie London, she has the right backing ensemble, she can really sing the blues. Again, Ethel Ennis, more fantastic Jack Teagarden, and more fucking June Christie. It's just really good stuff. Peggy Lee, more Nat Cole. So you're seeing a lot of these same singers show up and make a lot of records, obviously. And justifiably so. These records sold well, as did Stan Kenton. Nat Cole, 1190 and 1220. Some of these are inserted a little bit out of sequence because they were stuff I added in the last few months. There's another Hank Jones record, Porgy and Bess. Look to Your Heart, Frank Sinatra, and that's a fine record. He's about to leave and form Reprise here fairly soon, but Capitol still issues this stuff for a while yet. There's some George Shearing. He has a lot of stuff at Capitol. I don't have much of it. More June Christie, those Kenton days. Peggy Lee, that's a great record. This must be the Plas Johnson, one of the great forgotten sax players. Just a great tenorman. Really instrumental in the Hollywood scene. Jonah Jones, more Peggy Lee, more Nat Cole with George Shearing. But back to Plas Johnson, his stuff at Capitol is worth picking up, man. It's great material. There's a Charlie Barnett record at Capitol. I think there's only one. More of the Jonah Jones, the trumpet player with 3 white women on the cover. Nice and easy, which is one of my favorite Sinatra songs. Ole Ali and Sinatra Swinging Sessions. So we're probably getting to 61, 62. Capitol doesn't seem to do too much bossa nova when that hits, actually. They do have some Lauren Almeida and stuff, but Christie, more Dakota Staton. And most of these records have 1 or 2 songs that will just kill you. The 836 called The Wildest, that's a great Louis Prima record. The Wildest Comes Home is actually quite a bit later, not a sequence here, but great stuff. Bill Holman, that probably should have been in the 6500 series, which we'll see in a little bit. Dean Martin, boy, that's a great record, and I love that song. You're nobody till somebody love. That Plas Johnson is also fantastic. A great showcase for Plas. Dave Powell, the old South Wales, great stuff. More George Shearing with Nancy Wilson. Peggy Lee. Frank Sinatra, Come Swing With Me. So Shearing is showing up a lot in these dual roles where he's kind of featured alongside someone. In the Ellington Comp, Kenton's West Side Story, Peggy Lee, If You Go. That's done by Quincy Jones. And Quincy has his hands on a lot of these type of records. Nancy Wilson with Cannonball Adderley, which is one of her first LPs. a great Martin record. That's a really good Peggy Lee record, again, with Quincy Jones behind the wheel, Point of No Return by Sinatra. June Christie is a fine place to start with hers, that greatest hits collection, even though you're going to be missing some of her early stuff with Kenton. While This Comes So Much, we already talked about. Sinatra Sings, just one of those things. No, it's not that. It's of something of love and things like it is. Bewitching, some great Peggy Lee, Sugar and Spice. Ramblin' Rose is some good kind of country, almost folky stuff by the great Nat Cole. Stan Kenton, Adventures in Jazz. Peggy Lee, I'm a Woman. I mean, she's a spicy gal. She's got a lot of cheek to her, which I'm sure is what a lot of people love about her. She's a bit of a temptress, I would say. Charlie Shaver's great record by a great trumpet player who's very forgotten today. A fun guy who could do Armstrong. He could do Eldridge. I love Cha 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 D'Amore by Dean Martin. And now Lou Rawls kind of shows up here, and he makes a lot of records for Capitol in the 60s. It's soul with elements of jazz. Sinatra, more Nat Cole, more, again, Nat Cole, Crazy Days of Summer, 1932. So we're kind of wrapping up the second 1,000 records. Nancy Wilson, there's some more Howard Roberts, the great guitarist, who, again, deserves a lot of accolades, and he was a part of the Wrecking Crew. Great Sinatra collection. Tobacco Road's a fantastic Lou Rawls record, and Onsie Matthews is a name worth remembering. He's an important guy who really has some great production and arranging skills. Nat Cole, Gilberto Jobim, there's some bossa nova stuff showing up. Lorinda Balmiena, there's some bossa nova stuff showing up. But there's not a lot compared to some labels. Martin, more Howard Roberts. I like all Howard Roberts' Capitol stuff. It's a little commercial, but he was a great white talented guitar player who could really play. Junior Mance, that's not edgy, but again, it's all straight ahead. But it's still black and current. King Curtis, black and current, but again, a lot of rhythm and blues. The great Texas Tenorman, more Junior Mance, who goes back to Verve, and of course has a lot of stuff at Riverside. And more Kenton, more Nat Cole, more Lou Rawls. We're going to kind of wrap up the Kenton, the stuff here from this series pretty soon. Another great Howard Roberts, another great Peggy Lee record. So it's, again, you're seeing what Capitol's doing. This is the jazziest stuff that Capitol really has to offer. Nancy Wilson, the David McCollum record, he was a producer guy. And Dr. Dre sampled that. The song Next Episode comes from a song on there. Doom, doom, doom. More Nancy, more Dean Martin, Cannonball Adderley. His signing to Capitol was probably the equivalent of Rollins going to RCA. And, it gave them kind of someone who was still kind of legitimately in the game. I like that Goodies by Howard Roberts, more Linda Almeida, and then Lou Rawls. Those are the three great Lou Rawls records. And he's not writing his own stuff. He's not like Stevie Wonder. He's just a great singer with a lot of gospel and a lot of soul with some jazz roots. We're getting later Peggy Lee, some Stan Kenton collection, more later Lou Rawls, 2566. So there's not a whole lot left to show you here. Dean Martin, great collection, worth having. More Cannonball Adderley, again later Peggy Lee. And we're going to be pretty soon getting into that 6500 series, which again is only a dozen titles. That's actually a reissue of Riverside Cannonball Adderley record that was kind of a bossa nova thing, more Rawls. This is a 8000 sequence, which is like a Latin jazz sequence at Capitol. I only have a few titles in that, but it's not part of the regular sequence. This is, again, another sequence that kind of has that same kind of... it was a collection series. That's Birth of the Cool again, and they're just good places to start. Now, here's the 6500. Bill Holman, Bob Cooper, Claude Williamson. These are all 10 inches, and those all kick ass. Frank Rosolino, Boots Mazzulli, Sal Salvador, kick ass. Serge Sheloff, Frank Rosolino, more Claude Williamson, Bob Cooper, and those other two there, Boletto and Ken Hanna, are good, but they're not as good as those other ones. So that wraps up this episode. Hope you all enjoyed that. We'll talk to you all soon. Peace.